As Dr. Prabhu Singh is not around, I would like to borrow one of his sermon jokes for today. A preacher who is known for his really long sermons was invited to preach in a church. So when it was time for delivering the sermon, the pastor of the church stood up to introduce the preacher and said, preacher for today needs no introduction. All he needs is a conclusion. I'm not going to say anything further on that. But the topic is the stewardship. So the pastor had some struggle with the stewardship of time. Probably I won't, I hope. Stewardship is often understood in probably exclusively in terms of the financial resources. So stewardship is always connected to money. But I think stewardship is much more encompassing. Probably by the end of the sermon, we would try to understand that the stewardship encompasses our very being, our very existence. And possibly to understand that, we will look at the topic stewardship as stewardship as worship. So, lessons from David's prayer. So if you still remember the last time also I spoke from David for obvious reasons. So today so that's the beginning of David's, if we call it ministry. He became the king. But now the scene is almost at his fag end of his life. He's a frail old man, very ill. Possibly, there were times he could not even control his own children. So that's the situation. So over the period of his time as king of Israel, of course, he was one of the most successful kings of the time, probably of all time for the Israelites. But then he comes to this particular point, and the occasion, as it was read from chapter 29, First Chronicles, the context is the coronation of Solomon. So this is something God has promised to him. Of course, on the way, David has to face a lot of struggle. When he was a frail old man, first Absalom launched a kind of usurping the throne, and David has to be a fugitive for some time before he could be restored. And in the process, he loses Absalom as Joab annihilates him. And then comes Adonijah. Though it was very obvious that David wants Solomon to be the king, because that's what God has promised, but then Adonijah again takes the support of Joab, the army commander, so loyal to David all this time, and Abiathar, the high priest. And he was he has got the throne, Adonijah, against the wishes of David, and again, David was able to somehow restore some stability to the kingdom by bringing Solomon. So that's the context. But again, to understand what does this mean to David and to the Israelites, we have to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 16. So that's where God promises that the crux of Davidic covenant is that God will restore or continue the kingdom and the household of David forever and ever. Of course, it didn't happen until Messiah, Christ, who is in the lineage of David, comes in. So that's the promise. Probably David would not have understood the scope of the whole covenantal promise that was offered to him. But then, as he sees, the whole promise coming to fruition, at this point when Solomon is being installed as the king, his heart overflows with joy. But that's not the only occasion, only context. There's another context to it. God does send Nathan to David to tell him that he will not be the one to build the temple. So this is something of a life purpose for David, to build the kingdom for God. But then God says, no, you're not the one who is going to do. That is your son. So possibly, David would have gone through, could have, I hope he didn't, could have gone through a time of remorse, because most of the time we fix purposes for our lives, and we move towards it. Though David accomplished a great extent in terms of conquering the territories, providing stability, alliances with the neighboring countries, he was one of the most successful kings, no doubt about it. But then at this point, his ambition was to build this temple, a grand temple for God, because his devotion to God trumps everything else. He's not so concerned about what the kingdom offered to him, but rather he wanted to build this temple, but God says no. But unlike most of us, or probably me, who would be going through regrets and resentment, what David does is, what can I do? So that's the context, actually. So instead of resenting that God is not allowing him to proceed with his ambition to build a temple for the Lord, he is accumulating the resources. So that's where the stewardship starts. That's why particularly this passage spoke to me. The stewardship starts even when God is saying no to his own life purposes, asking him to direct his life path in a different way, bringing his son onto the throne and supporting him. So that's the context. So the first aspect of stewardship I would like to highlight from David's prayer is though he has accomplished all his wealth, all this wealth, but he's not thinking that I have done this. Of course, you can contrast it with what Nebuchadnezzar did. So he built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the architectural marvel of those times, and probably other structures, which he stood before and saw, wow, my hands have done all this. This is exactly what he says. And then, of course, God puts him along with the wild beast and then restores him. But David, instead of seeing all these accomplishments as something of his own, he is able to acknowledge God's ownership. So stewardship starts, of course, when we align our purposes with God's purposes, though at times it may be contradictory to our own ambitions, and then within which what I can do. So he accumulates this wealth and acknowledges the ownership of God over the resources. So as I was mentioning, stewardship is often understood in this exclusive financial terms, but stewardship is about resources in general that encompasses our very existence. It could be time, it could be people, it could be money, it could be space, it could be opportunities. So stewardship is, it's a very broad term, but oftentimes when we are so narrowly focused on money, which the Pharisees did, as Jesus accuses them, they would rather count the seeds, in tithing, but they would forget the justice, God's justice and mercy. But when we take away from our eyes on the resources, especially the financial resources, and then focus on the all-encompassing resources or opportunities God has provided, then it allows us to acknowledge the ownership of the Lord. So one of the things David does right at this point is, yes, his purposes have been countered, but then he was not into resentment, and he accumulates the wealth, and he still acknowledges the ownership of God in his life. So when we read verses 14 to 16, I would like to read again. So he says, "But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to make this free will offering? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are aliens and transients before you, as were all our ancestors. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no hope. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building your house for your holy name comes from your hand, is all your own." So one of the things that brings me back to meditating on David's life is he often asks this: "Who am I? Who am I?" So that's the question actually. He is able to somehow move him to his past. I have met people whom I know for decades would completely dismiss their past, completely unmoved from their past because they don't want to remember the past. But David, for his part, one thing again he did right was always he was able to move himself into the past life. Of course, he knows who he is. He was not even considered by his father to be brought before Samuel. That insignificant he was. But then he was ordained by God to be the king. So he was able to look back and then see how God has provided all these opportunities and resources in his life. And what he has now is God's own. So that is the acknowledgement God gives. So in our life, if we look back, we look at the resources God has provided. If we can say, only we can say when we are not unmoved from the past, but when we are anchored in the past, we should not allow the past to define us, but we should not forget the past, because past is somehow that gives the purpose to the present as well as the future. So David was very keen in acknowledging the past, not allowing that to define him, but then able to say, God, who am I? And in fact, before Saul, he would say twice, I'm a flea on a dog. I mean, you can't humiliate yourself, self-deprecate yourself beyond that. So that's the kind of attitude David has before God. So the first aspect when we make stewardship as a worship, it should emerge out of our own acknowledgement that all that I have accomplished, quote unquote, is from God. It's not my own doing, but rather it's God's offer to my life. So that not only reflects in David's life, but that also reflects in Israel's own prosperity. Because again, they didn't have a king. Saul came, but then consistent warfare with Philistines, the loss of lives. But then David was able to give a stability, to the kingdom. And so they also acknowledge God's own hand in terms of providing them the stability and peace in the empire. So stewardship begins with the humble acknowledgement that God owns all. So that's the first thing. And we are mere caretakers, not owners. Of course, one of the ways we try to understand our relationship with creation is again based on this word stewardship. Not have to dominion, but that word is often often rightly interpreted as stewardship. So stewardship is about the resources, how we don't claim them to be our own, but then acknowledge that God is the one who has provided those resources in our life. And David was able to acknowledge that ownership. And out of that acknowledgement comes his response. So how does he respond? Responds with complete generosity and joy. If you see, as a king, as his role, he did not not only accumulated all those things, he accumulated gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and everything. The wood and everything that Solomon would need to build the temple, but then he opens his personal treasury, his own collection of gifts and other things, and then offers that also to God. So seeing his own generosity, of course, the leaders of the people and the people also offer. So there is an outflow of generosity, and through the generosity of giving, there is joy. So oftentimes, again, to take the example of Pharisees, we become so legalistic in terms of counting our resources and offering back to God. Over the years, I have also done this mistake of giving back to God, but in a grudging way. If only I could save this money, I could buy this. Now, I have gone through that. I don't know whether you did, but I have. So that is not the way. Why did I do that? Why do I give grudgingly? Because I'm not able to acknowledge that these resources are all from God. I think that I earned it. I am entitled to something, and I'm giving it to God, probably to appease or probably to gain favor. But David is teaching us stewardship, whether it's money, resources, people, whatever it is, it's giving with generosity. But that generosity and joy can come only when we have the right attitude to our resources, by acknowledging that everything that God owns, we are mere caretakers. So David has this right understanding in his heart to know that the resources God has provided. And then again, as I said, one of the things keeps talking to me is he could have gone through resentment. Probably I would have gone through. But then he is channeling, whatever purposes God has directed him towards what he can accomplish. So he's not allowing, again, the past of not being able to build the temple, but then he channels it because he has this right attitude and a right response in terms of generosity. Sometime back, Dr. Avila spoke about Barnabas and Paul. So Barnabas' role is to bring the Saul of Tarsus to Antioch and then launch him onto this significant ministry and then take a back seat. So some of us probably are Barnabases, but if we want to be Sauls, we are probably working against God's purposes. So same with Jonathan, David's closest friend, the person who was entitled to the throne, but once he acknowledged that David is the anointed one of God, he takes a back seat. So, it's very difficult for us to accept, but then that is how David is able to make sense of his own life purposes, not pushing on towards his own set goals, but rather allowing God to work his life and use it as an opportunity to give back to God in terms of the resources as well as in terms of response with joy. So true stewardship is not duty, but delight. So that's where the Pharisees completely were mistaken. They took it as a legalistic obligation. They set rules and they followed the rules probably to the letter, but there was no spirit in their action. That's why Jesus had to condemn them for what they were doing. But we probably might end up as Pharisees, if we don't have a right relationship with the resources in our life. So first of all, it is all God's own resources offered to us as caretakers. And then when I have that right understanding, I will be able to work with stewardship. So the final point I would like to highlight is David's life also at this point reflects a heart of integrity. When I read this, actually, particularly verses 17 to 18, he says, God, I'm coming with my integrity. Of all, David is saying he's the one who is coming with integrity. You can see what his life is about, those period of kingship. He has done things probably no one should do. But then, as I mentioned, David knows his own failings. David learned integrity through his own failures. And again, one of the things that attracts me to David is, he's not perfect in any way. Probably he's one of the, least among people who can be considered as perfect. But even then, one of the things David is able to, we can see that being reflected in several of his Psalms also. He's able to crawl back to God. I used the same phrase last time also. That kind of speaks to me. God is not expecting you and me to be perfect. We will not be perfect. We will keep failing. But what God expects, what God expects as from David's life, that is that he was considered as a man after God's own heart, is because of his ability to crawl back to God, to completely prostrate before God's presence and then ask God's forgiveness and be restored. We live in New Testament times. Probably I don't know how David understood repentance and forgiveness, but we know how it is. Christ has done it all, and then we come into the presence of God in the name of Christ, and we are offered this forgiveness. So as I said, it's the attitude counts. First of all, the attitude to look at the resources as God's own, and then the response defined by that attitude is one of generosity and joy, but that cannot happen as a pretense. I can do one time, that, and then go away and live my life. But I can put up big show before people that I have offered something with generosity. But if it has to become a lifestyle, it has to be rooted in terms of our own integrity. And when we, I think that's one of the key phrases that will define our Christian living. We have seen so many examples of people who started like having a flamboyant life in terms of ministry, but then ending up because they somewhere along the line missed the plot, and then they said, I have done all this. So their very outlook towards ministry became kind of egocentric rather than God-centric. So David was able to have that right attitude, and at this point he says, Lord, I'm coming with the right intent, with the right integrity I come, of course, because of God's forgiveness. And we need to have that integrity in our life. So when we have that integrity of coming before God, and every time we have this response of gratitude and joy that outflows from our life, irrespective of all that David failing is. It's a miserable failure. I mean, his own daughter being molested by his son, and then Absalom, his own son, usurping the throne. Now Adonijah, not obeying his own dictate. So it's not a very comfortable life. We sang, it's a messy life. But then, in spite of all that messiness, David was able to come before God, crawl before God, prostrate before God, having the right attitude, right response, and the right intent that God is able to bless him and his generation, that we do refer to Jesus as the Christ as the Son of David. So today, I have just one more slide. So NT also exhorts, in terms of, so stewardship is about a worship. So David makes it as an offer of worship. So the generosity and joy is an offer of worship. So worship rooted in humility, joy, and integrity. That's stewardship. Stewardship is not something compartmentalized. Some money you give to God and your stewardship is over. No, it encompasses whole of our being. And when it encompasses our whole of being, it's an outflow of worship. So that is how David understood. So God loves a cheerful giver. Even Paul says, Corinthians. So how that cheerfulness, generosity, and joy comes into our life when we have the right attitude of acknowledging God as the source of everything. And then when we have the right response in joy, and when we have the right intent of having integrity coming before God, then stewardship becomes an act of worship. So just imagine the resources you have. If you think you have less, or if you have more, how do you look at those resources? Do you think they are all mine and I'm giving something back to God, or are we having the right attitude of God has given and I'm just a caretaker? When that attitude comes, then it will become an act of worship, ending up in generosity and joy and blessing in our lives. May God bless the hearing of this verse. Shall we close our eyes and look to God? Past ought not to be forgotten, though we don't allow the past to define our lives. But if we forget the past, the present cannot have purpose, and probably the future will turn bleak. May God give us that grace, as David was able to know that he started as a shepherd boy, as an insignificant existence, but then all that he has, this accomplishment of a great kingdom, the stability, the peace, and the prosperity, they are all God's offering to him as a caretaker. Can we offer that acknowledgement today morning that God, whatever I have in my life, the resources, the finance, the time, the people, the space, the opportunities, it all comes from you, God. You own it all. Can we acknowledge that today? When we have that right attitude of acknowledging God's ownership, then we'll be able to respond back to him in generosity and joy. Are there times you have grumblingly given to God? If that's the case, probably it's because we don't have the right attitude towards our resources. May God help us today to have the right attitude, that we will turn the whole stewardship into an act of worship. Father God, thank you for your words. Thank you for speaking to us through the life of David. Irrespective of all his failings, he was able to come back to you, to be even acknowledge that he is a man after your own heart. Lord, we know our own failings. I pray that, Lord, you will restore us, Give us the right attitude to acknowledge your ownership in every aspect of our lives, the resources you have provided in our lives. And also give us the right response of giving back to you in generosity and joy, that, Lord, you will continue to bless us and make us conduits of your blessing in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray.